Ever wondered how it felt to fall asleep in a world without heat, where winter crept into your bones and survival meant outsmarting the cold itself? Tonight, you'll step into that frost-bitten silence of medieval nights, where every breath could crystallize midair and warmth was a privilege few could afford. Hey guys, tonight we're not in your cozy bed or under a fleece blanket. You're waking up inside a small timber hut, and the first thing you feel isn't comfort. It's cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you reach for another layer, but the kind that presses against your ribs and makes your breath hang in the air like smoke. You blink, and you can see your breath curl into the dim morning light. Your hands are numb before you even move them. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, we'll take it slow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes again. The roof above you is made of rough wooden planks, uneven and dark with soot. Bits of frost cling to the corners, tiny white veins spreading along the grain. You can hear the faint creak of wind pushing against the walls. It's winter in the 14th century, and the world outside has frozen over like glass. There's no electricity, no heater humming nearby, just the faint smell of last night's ashes. You pull your blanket closer, but it's not really a blanket at all. More like a pile of coarse wool and scraps sewn together. Your feet are wrapped in straw for insulation, a trick peasants swore by. If you're lucky, your family shares body heat in the same bed. Hot bedding, they called it centuries later, but back now it's just called surviving. You push yourself up and instantly regret it. The air cuts at your skin like 1,000 tiny knives. Your breath fogs up, drifting across the tiny room. A clay pot sits by the hearth, cold and cracked. The ashes inside are gray and lifeless, but you stir them anyway, hoping for a single coal to glow red again. Sometimes people would guard the last ember from the night before like treasure, because without it, you'd have to start a fire from scratch. And in this damp, freezing world, that's no small feat. Outside, the village looks half dead. Roofs sag under the weight of snow. The paths between houses are solid ice. Somewhere, a rooster crows weakly, confused by the lack of dawn light. Winter has swallowed everything: sound, color, even smell. You hear your stomach growl. Food's been scarce since the frost came early this year. This isn't the kind of winter you know. There's no first snow selfie, no cocoa mug, no Netflix marathon. It's the kind of season that kills you slowly, through hunger, infection, or despair. Historians still argue whether the average medieval winter was truly colder than today's, or if people simply lacked protection against it. But the stories we have, letters, chronicles, poems, speak of winters so brutal that entire rivers froze solid. The Thames in England became a white road, and peasants crossed it like a bridge. You step outside and feel your lashes stiffen. The sky's a dull gray, heavy and close. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the slow creak of wood, someone chopping firewood, or maybe a cart frozen in place. You clutch your cloak tighter. It's made of wool, yes, but it's thin, and wind slips through it like whispers. You pull the hood over your head, tucking your chin down like you've seen others do. It helps barely. People learned tricks to survive this. They packed straw in their shoes, stuffed moss into the gaps of their homes, sealed windows with animal fat. Some even smeared mud mixed with dung between the logs to block drafts. Disgusting? Sure. But when your nose feels like glass about to crack, you stop caring about the smell. You trudge toward the village well. The bucket rope is stiff, crusted with ice. You chip it free with a stick. The water below glints faintly, a dark mirror under a sheet of frost. You break through, fill your bucket, and it feels heavier than usual. Back at your hut, you'll set it near the fire to melt slightly, enough to drink before it freezes again. A few children run past you, their laughter brittle and sharp in the cold air. They're wrapped in mismatched clothes, some wearing rags over bare feet. They kick at chunks of ice, pretending they're stones. It's a game, but you can see their lips are blue. Childhood didn't last long here, especially in winter. You remember hearing tales of winters that never seemed to end. In the year 1315, chroniclers wrote of great hunger across Europe. Crops failed 3 years in a row, livestock froze in their barns, and thousands starved. The smell of smoke became constant, not just from fires, but from burning thatch and wooden fences people tore down to keep warm. One monk described villages where no dog barked and no child cried. Whether he exaggerated or not, no one could deny that cold had teeth. As you walk back to your hut, you pass the blacksmith's forge, silent, his tools frozen solid. Even iron won't bend when it's this cold. The village feels like it's holding its breath. The church bell hasn't rung in days. The ropes frozen stiff. The priest probably huddles in his chambers, writing sermons about endurance and God's will. In times like this, faith wasn't just comfort, it was insulation. Inside your home again, you crouch before the hearth and strike flint against steel. Sparks leap, bright, fleeting stars. You blow gently, coaxing life into a tiny flame. When it catches, the relief is almost physical. The smoke stings your eyes, but you don't care. Firelight flickers across the walls, revealing shapes. Your family, bundled in furs, asleep close together. You settle beside them, rubbing your hands before the flame. The sound of crackling wood is hypnotic. There's warmth, yes, but also hope. You close your eyes and listen. The distant wind outside, the rhythmic breathing beside you, the occasional pop of sap in the fire. For a moment, the cold retreats, held back by one small, defiant light. You might think you'd get used to it, that after months of frost, your body would adapt. But no, every day, the cold feels new, sharper, meaner, more personal. It seeps into your bones, into your thoughts. People back then used to say the cold wasn't just weather, it was punishment, a reminder of human frailty. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were superstition or a genuine reflection of the climate despair that swept Europe. Either way, it shaped how they lived, prayed, and dreamed. As you lie back, staring into the fire, your eyelids grow heavy. The flame dances behind your vision. You wonder if tomorrow will be any warmer. Probably not. But tonight, you have this straw under your feet, smoke in your lungs, and the quiet heartbeat of survival. The next morning, you wake to silence. An eerie, heavy kind of stillness that feels like the world has been wrapped in wool. Your fire has gone out again. You exhale, and your breath curls upward like ghostly smoke. The chill has crept back into every corner of the room. Your fingers ache, stiff and white, and when you reach for the nearest log, the bark burns your skin. Not with heat, but with cold so sharp it stings. Outside, the war against winter continues. You step into a landscape drained of color. White snow, gray sky, and brown, frozen earth. The sun is up, technically, but it hides behind a sheet of cloud so thick it looks like old linen. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp wool. Every sound feels muffled, trapped under layers of frost. It's not just cold, it's enemy territory. People in the Middle Ages didn't talk about weather like we do now. They talked about survival. Entire villages lived or died depending on how well they could prepare for months of frost. A single bad harvest, a roof that leaked, or a lost cow could mean the difference between life and death. Historians still argue whether this era's winters were truly colder, or whether people were simply more vulnerable without the comforts of modern life. Either way, winter was a battlefield, and everyone fought in it. You join a group of villagers trudging toward the forest. Their faces are hidden under layers of rags, scarves, and old cloaks patched with bits of leather. Each carries something: an axe, a bundle of straw, a rope. You carry nothing but hope and a small knife at your belt. You're hunting, not for food, but for warmth. The trees loom tall and skeletal, their branches heavy with snow. Somewhere deep within, you hear the dull thunk of an axe biting into wood. Firewood is life, but it's running out fast. Every household has already stripped the edges of the forest bare. Some have started burning old furniture, broken carts, even bits of their own fences. The smell of burning oak mixed with resin fills the air, a scent both comforting and desperate. You find a fallen branch, thick enough to last the night. It's frozen solid, heavy as stone. You chip at it, fingers numbing, breath rasping in your chest. A villager beside you grunts. If you can't split it, you'll freeze before morning. You nod, pretending not to feel the ache in your arms. There's an art to chopping wood in this cold. Strike too shallow, and the axe glances off. Too deep, and the frost cracks the blade. You find a rhythm. Lift, swing, crack, breathe. Tiny shards of ice spray from the log like glass. Your body starts to warm, not from the air, but from effort. It's the medieval version of a workout, except the prize isn't fitness. It's survival. By noon, your hands are raw, your back screams, and you've gathered a pitiful pile of logs. But it's something. You tie them with rope and drag them home through the snow. The path has grown slick with ice, and every step feels like walking on glass. Halfway back, you pass a group of men huddled around a pit. They're digging slowly, carefully, because the earth is frozen solid. A burial, you realize. Someone didn't make it through the night. Maybe old age, maybe illness, maybe just exhaustion. Death feels casual here, quiet and practical. The priest mutters a prayer, his breath turning to mist, and then they shovel frozen soil over the body. No tears, no wails, just a grim acknowledgement of the cold's victory. You look away. You have to. Back home, you pile the logs by the hearth and strike flint to steel again. Sparks jump, one catches, and the fire is born. You sit close, almost too close, feeling your cheeks sting as blood returns to your skin. Around you, the small hut fills with the smell of smoke, sweat, and damp wool. It's unpleasant, but it's alive. This is what the war against winter looked like. Small, daily victories that barely kept you breathing. People shared fires between households, rotated chores, and rationed every scrap of food. If one family's fire went out, another might lend a coal wrapped in moss or a clump of straw still smoldering. The smallest kindness could mean survival. Still, there were darker sides to this struggle. In some places, desperate villagers stole firewood from churches or nobles' lands. There are records of peasants executed for wood theft, a crime treated almost like treason. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You could die for trying not to die. As the day fades, you walk outside again. Snow falls now in thick, lazy flakes. Each one lands silently, layering over everything like dust on forgotten relics. The village looks peaceful, almost beautiful, but you know better. Beneath that calm white surface lies hunger, sickness, and fear. You remember a story an old monk once told about the winter of 1349. He said the air froze so hard that birds dropped mid-flight, their wings stiff before they hit the ground. Sounds impossible, and maybe it was. Historians still argue whether such tales were exaggerations or a kind of medieval metaphor. Cold so deep it killed even the sky. But to the people who lived it, that distinction didn't matter. Truth was whatever hurt you most. Later, as the wind picks up, you step inside again and press the door shut against it. You sit by the fire, watching the flames lick the logs. Outside, the storm hums like an angry beast, clawing at the roof. You wrap your cloak tighter, listening to the wind moan through the cracks. The sound is almost human. A long, low wail that seems to echo from every corner of the world. You think about how people must have felt back then. Trapped, tiny, helpless before nature's vast indifference. And yet they endured. They learned to read the sky, to ration the grain, to find warmth in each other. You imagine mothers humming lullabies under smoke-darkened rafters, farmers mending tools by candlelight, lovers whispering beneath ragged blankets. Against all odds, life persisted. Somewhere outside, the storm begins to fade. The wind softens, the snow slows. You close your eyes and let the crackle of fire fill your mind. Tomorrow, the war will start again, the same chopping, carrying, burning, but for now, you've won a small battle. You breathe in smoke and warmth, exhale frost and fear. The war against winter isn't fought with swords. It's fought with stubbornness, with faith, and with firelight. And tonight, you've survived it once more. When the fire dies down again, you're left with a question that feels as old as the frost itself. What do you wear when the world wants to freeze you alive? You glance down at your sleeves. Wool, coarse and stiff, stitched unevenly with a dozen different colors of thread. Every patch tells a story, not of fashion but of survival. In the medieval world, warmth was a privilege. The rich wrapped themselves in furs, layers of thick velvet, and linen underclothes so soft they almost whispered against the skin. The poor, they wore whatever scraps they could find. Rags, old sacks, sometimes even strips of animal hide stiffened with salt. You run your hand along your cloak, feel the prickly edge of the wool. It's itchy, it smells faintly of smoke and sweat, but it's life-saving. You pull it tighter around you and remember the words of an old proverb. Better a rough cloak warm than a fine one thin. There's truth in that. This morning, the village is alive with movement again. People shuffle between homes, hauling wood, carrying buckets, stamping their feet against the cold. Everyone looks like a bundle of fabric with a face somewhere deep inside. Layers, that's the secret. Even medieval doctors wrote about it. They believed that cold air could slip into your body through pores of weakness, stealing your strength, so every gap had to be sealed. You pass a woman tying rags around her legs, winding them from ankle to knee like makeshift leggings. Another man stuffs straw into his boots for insulation. It rustles with every step, but he swears it works. You think of your own feet, wrapped in wool and hope, and you decide he's probably right. In the market square, if you can call it that, traders from nearby villages have come to barter. One offers fox pelts, another thick mittens stitched from rabbit fur. They're expensive but priceless. People trade everything for warmth. A loaf of bread, a jug of ale, even a family heirloom. Firewood and fabric become currency in these months. Gold won't keep you from freezing. You touch one of the furs. A deep brown pelt, soft as breath. And for a moment you feel almost royal. But then you remember where it came from. An animal hunted in desperation, skinned in the dark, its warmth transferred from one body to another. That's what winter does. It makes warmth a kind of inheritance. Historians still argue whether medieval clothing was truly as filthy and tattered as we imagine, or if that's just a product of romantic exaggeration. Paintings often show nobles gleaming in color, peasants draped in earth tones, but reality likely smelled much worse. Wool wasn't washed often. Couldn't be. Wet wool loses its shape, and drying it indoors risks mold and smoke. So people wore their layers until they could stand up on their own. You tug at your collar. The smell isn't pleasant. A mix of old sweat, soot, and damp earth, but it feels like armor. There's something strangely comforting about it. This is your skin now, woven from the same hardship as everyone else's. By midday, the weak sun pushes through the clouds, and the air softens slightly. You decide to walk to the church. Inside, it's even colder. Stone doesn't hold heat, it hoards it like a miser. But there's a kind of peace here, a stillness broken only by the faint shuffle of feet and the soft whisper of cloth as people kneel to pray. The priest wears heavy robes of wool lined with fur. The fabric sways as he moves, like smoke in candlelight. Even in faith, warmth is a mark of status. You watch as a beggar near the back wraps himself in a ragged blanket. His lips blue but still murmuring a prayer. You wonder if he's asking for food or just a bit of sun. After the service, you step outside into the biting wind again. The villagers talk quietly as they walk home, faces hidden beneath hoods. The cold flattens conversation. Words feel heavier in the air, slower to leave your mouth. You pass a boy dragging a sheep behind him, its wool thick and matted. For many, animals were walking coats. People slept beside their livestock for warmth, sharing breath in the dark. In some homes, pigs or goats slept under the same roof, the floor layered with straw and manure. It wasn't luxury, but it kept the air above freezing. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants tolerated the smell or simply stopped noticing it. Either way, warmth came before dignity. Back home, you pull off your cloak and hang it near the fire. It steams faintly, releasing the scent of wet wool and smoke. You sit close again, rubbing your hands together. The heat prickles your skin, and for a moment you feel human again. You think about what people used to wear to bed. Forget silk pajamas, nightwear didn't exist for most. You'd crawl into bed fully clothed, sometimes even wearing your shoes if the floor was icy. Some wrapped their heads in scarves to keep from losing heat through the scalp. Others slept inside large sacks, yes, literal sacks, stuffed with hay. The hay would crunch beneath you, softening slightly with your body heat, though it often brought fleas as companions. There's an old account from a French manor where servants slept in the kitchens, curled near the embers, their clothes stiff with soot. The wealthy, meanwhile, had fur-lined chambers, feather beds, and heated stones wrapped in cloth placed between the sheets. They called them bed warmers. You call them unfair. A joke slips into your thoughts. If reincarnation is real, pray you don't come back as a peasant in January. But humor has always been a kind of insulation, too. In the darkest nights, people told jokes, riddles, or bawdy songs just to stay awake, because laughter kept the blood moving. Somewhere in a tavern not far from your village, you can almost hear it. The rattle of mugs, a hoarse laugh, the clatter of boots against a wooden floor. Even joy becomes rebellion when the cold wants to take everything. You pull your blanket tighter, lay back, and listen to the wind. Every rustle of fabric, every creak of timber feels like the world breathing with you. The war against winter isn't just fought outside. It's fought on your skin, in your clothes, in every stitch of fabric that stands between you and the frozen dark. Somewhere deep inside, you know that no matter how many layers you pile on, the cold always finds a way in. But still, you layer, patch, and wrap yourself again. Because that's what survival looks like. 1,000 small defiant choices stitched together, one thread at a time. The fire is alive again tonight. Its glow paints gold and amber across the rough walls, flickering in the soot-blackened corners of your hut. You sit close, too close, and still the cold presses in. Outside, wind hisses under the door, but in here, every crackle of flame feels like a small act of rebellion. This, you realize, is what stands between life and silence. The hearth. It's not much to look at. A shallow pit of stone, ringed by ashes, fed with whatever scraps of fuel you can gather, logs, twigs, dry dung if you must. But this is the heart of every home. The word hearth even shares roots with heart, and that's no coincidence. It's where families gather, meals simmer, stories are whispered, and prayers are mumbled into smoke. It's warmth, light, and comfort in a world designed to take all three. You poke the fire gently with a stick, watching sparks leap upward like tiny spirits. The smell of burning oak fills the room, mingling with the damp musk of wool and old smoke. Your family sits around you, your mother mending a torn sleeve, your younger sister curled under a blanket, your father sharpening a blade. The air hums softly with quiet life. Outside, the snow deepens. Inside, you tell stories. That's how people survived long nights, by weaving warmth out of words. Someone starts a tale about a knight who fought the north wind, and before long, everyone's leaning in, laughing softly, eyes wide in the firelight. It doesn't matter that you've heard it before. Every retelling feels new when the world beyond your door could freeze you solid. Historians still argue whether medieval hearths were truly efficient for heating, or mostly symbolic. Archaeological evidence shows that many peasant homes had open hearths with no chimneys, meaning smoke filled the room before seeping out through holes in the roof. You imagine it now. Your eyes sting, your throat scratches, and yet no one complains. Smoke means fire, and fire means warmth. You shift closer, your face hot, your back freezing. The balance never quite works out, but it's better than the alternative. The wood hisses, spits sap, and somewhere behind you, your father hums a low tune. It's almost comforting until you hear the wind again. A slow, deep groan pressing against the door. You glance over, half expecting it to open on its own. Sometimes you wonder how anyone slept through nights like this. In the dark, with wolves howling from the forest and the walls trembling under the wind, the hearth wasn't just heat. It was protection. Fire kept predators away, visible and invisible. The flicker of light was a ward against everything that waited in the dark. You remember a story told by travelers, a strange one. They said that in the far north, families would keep their fires burning all winter, day and night, never letting them die. To lose the flame was bad luck. Some believed the household spirit lived inside the fire itself. If it went out, misfortune followed. You don't know if that's true, but tonight you feed the fire carefully anyway. Superstition and survival blur together easily when the temperature drops below reason. Your mother ladles something from a pot hanging over the flames. It's thin broth, mostly water, with a few wilted greens and maybe a scrap of salt pork. You sip it, and it burns your tongue, but the warmth spreads through your chest like a blessing. Food and fire share the same rhythm here. Slow, patient, necessary. As you eat, you think about how much the hearth defines everything. Even in grand castles, life revolved around it. Great halls glowed with roaring fires, tapestries fluttering on the walls, nobles feasting while servants turned spits heavy with meat. In those same hours, peasants like you sat by smaller flames, chewing stale bread and telling smaller stories. Yet both depended on the same magic. Fires dance against the dark. There's a saying from an Old Norse poem, "Fire is the best friend of man, but it could just as easily be his most dangerous." One careless ember, one gust of wind, and your home could vanish in minutes. Entire villages burned that way, wood, thatch, and straw turning into pyres under the moon. Even the smallest hearth demanded respect, like a god with moods. You add another log, careful not to smother the flames. The glow deepens. Shadows crawl across the ceiling like gentle ghosts. Your sister stirs in her sleep, murmuring softly, the sound blending with the fire's crackle. For the first time all day, you feel something close to peace. The hearth isn't just heat, it's heartbeat. People measured their lives by it, waking to rekindle embers, sleeping beside fading coals. Women guarded it like treasure. Men fed it from the forest, and children learned early not to touch its heart. It's strange how something so ordinary could carry so much weight. Without it, winter wins. Historians still argue about how communities organized around their hearths, whether they were purely domestic spaces or centers of communal life. Some say the hearth symbolized kinship itself, a shared warmth that defined belonging. To be cast out from the fire's light was the truest form of exile. The thought lingers as you gaze into the flames. Exile from warmth, from home, from the shared breath of family. It's unthinkable. You imagine a traveler, snow-covered and alone, approaching a cottage and begging for a place near the fire. Would you refuse him? Probably not. Even now, your family's flame burns brighter knowing someone might be wandering in the cold. A spark jumps, landing on your sleeve. You slap it away quickly, laughing under your breath. Fire, unpredictable as ever. Your mother scolds you half-heartedly. Your father chuckles, and the tension of the night breaks for a moment. Small laughter fills the smoky air. You add it to the list of things that keep you alive. Fire, food, and foolish jokes. Outside, the wind fades to a whisper. You watch the last log crumble into glowing embers. They pulse softly, like coals breathing. The room darkens, the warmth fades, and you know it's time to sleep. You spread your blanket beside the dying flame, close enough to feel its breath but not its bite. The last thing you see before you drift off is that faint orange light, pulsing steady, like the world's smallest sunrise held in a pit of stone. And you think, this is it. This is life in the medieval winter. No grand battles, no heroic speeches. Just the quiet endurance of keeping one small fire alive through the endless night. You wake up before dawn, and the frost has crept into your bones. The thin blanket of wool does little to stop the night chill that seeps from the stone floor. Your breath clouds the air, and you can almost trace the rhythm of your heartbeat in the condensation. Outside, the medieval cold hasn't loosened its grip. It's a slow, relentless visitor that stays for months. You rise, wrapping yourself in every layer you own, even if they all smell faintly of smoke and damp earth. Because today, like every other winter day, survival begins with warmth. Your first thought isn't about breakfast or prayers. It's about fire. A good hearth isn't just comfort. It's life itself. You shuffle toward the common room, where someone hopefully kept embers alive beneath the ashes overnight. If they failed, you'll be kneeling for an hour trying to coax life from the cold remnants, blowing into them until your lips go numb. Firewood is gold here. Every stick has a story. Cut, hauled, dried, and guarded as fiercely as bread. In wealthier homes, a servant or housewife might have started the fire already. In peasant cottages, though, everyone takes a turn. Sometimes, a single coal is borrowed from the neighbor's hearth, carried carefully in a clay pot or wrapped in moss. Sharing fire, they call it, a gesture that's both generous and desperate. Historians still argue whether this daily ritual was more about community or simple survival, but maybe those two things weren't so different back then. Once the flames catch, the smell of burning oak fills the room, a scent equal parts comfort and exhaustion. Smoke curls around the beams, stinging your eyes. There's no chimney, just a hole in the roof or wall, so the air tastes of soot. Yet this smoky haze is strangely soothing. It means warmth and it means safety. People in the Middle Ages would rather cough through the morning than freeze through the night. You pull a rough stool closer to the hearth. The heat is uneven. Your knees nearly burn while your back stays cold. A hunk of dark bread sits by the fire, hard as a rock until it's warmed. You hold it over the flame, watch it soften, and tear off a piece. Tastes like dust and salt, but for a moment it feels like luxury. You think about how the poor survived winters that could last 5, even 6 months. They didn't have central heating or glass windows. They had thick walls, small rooms, and bodies packed close together. Heat wasn't something you wasted, it was something you trapped. So, entire families slept in one bed, often with the livestock penned nearby for extra warmth. Imagine dozing off beside a cow while your brother elbows you for blanket space. Romantic? No. Effective? Absolutely. Then there were the curious bed warmers. Picture a shallow pan of hot coals slipped between sheets to chase away the chill. It sounds cozy until a few too many houses caught fire. Historians still debate whether this invention did more harm than good, but in an age when you'd kill for a warm bed, it must have felt worth the risk. And if you didn't have coals, you relied on bodies. Couples huddled together not out of passion, but for pure thermodynamics. Babies were swaddled so tightly they looked like tiny mummies, a trick to preserve heat. Even pets, when allowed indoors, curled close. Cats weren't just pest control. They were portable radiators with claws. Clothing, too, was a matter of strategy. Layers upon layers, linen under wool, wool under fur, and if you were lucky, lined boots stuffed with straw. You'd be amazed at how much warmth you could trap with enough dirt and determination. And while we imagine the medieval world draped in gray, the truth is winter clothes were surprisingly colorful, dyed with madder root, woad, and even crushed beetles. Turns out, humans have always wanted to look good, even when half frozen. By midday, the fire burns lower, and the battle for warmth shifts to maintenance. You stir the embers, add twigs sparingly, and save the logs for night. In wealthier towns, charcoal was prized for its long burn and clean smoke. But for most, fuel meant whatever you could scavenge. Fallen branches, dry dung, even old furniture. Some towns issued strict forest laws to stop peasants from stealing wood, a rule that turned warmth itself into a matter of legality. One of the more bizarre practices, burning animal bones. They gave off a faint heat and an awful smell, but when the forests ran bare, people adapted. Archaeologists have found layers of charred bone fragments in medieval hearths, proof of just how far desperation could go. Still, it's hard not to imagine that smoky scent haunting the village, burnt marrow mingling with stew and damp wool. And speaking of stew, that's your next shield against the cold. You ladle from the pot that's been simmering since yesterday. Medieval stew never really ended. It just evolved. Each day, you'd toss in whatever was available. Turnips, onions, yesterday's bread, and maybe, if fortune smiled, a shred of salted pork. The result was called pottage, part soup, part sludge, always warm. A bowl of it could chase away the worst of winter blues. By nightfall, you're back near the fire, the day's work done, hands raw from wood and wind. You look around the dim room, lit only by the faint orange flicker. The shadows seem alive, moving with each crack of the logs. You think of how darkness ruled these months, how every act of warmth was an act of defiance. Fire wasn't just a tool. It was your rebellion against the cold. A stray thought crosses your mind. How many winters could a person endure like this? How many nights of smoke-choked air and stiff fingers before spring feels like salvation? You smile a little because deep down, survival is stubborn. Humans have always found a way to stay warm, even when the world itself turned against them. You stretch out, pull your cloak tighter, and watch the last ember fade. Tomorrow, the cycle begins again. Fire, smoke, stew, sleep. The ancient rhythm of staying alive, one flame at a time. By now, the cold feels less like weather and more like a creature you live beside. Something that breathes at your door and watches through cracks in the walls. You've learned to coexist with it, to bargain for small mercies. But in the medieval world, even the best hearth couldn't protect you from one unrelenting fact. Winter starved. The countryside in January is a painting drained of color. Fields lie fallow, rivers slow beneath crusts of ice, and barns echo with a hollow kind of emptiness. You pull on your boots, stiff from yesterday's frost, and step into a landscape that seems to have forgotten sound. Every step crunches like broken glass. By this point in the year, your stores are thin. Grain bins are low, salted meat is rationed, and what little produce remains is wrinkled and sour. You remember the autumn's harvest feasts, all laughter and ale and promises of plenty. That joy feels like a dream now. Hunger presses closer each day, a constant, polite guest that never leaves. You open the pantry and count what's left. Maybe a few onions, some beans, the heel of a hard cheese. Salted fish if you're lucky. You think about stretching it out, how every medieval family learned to make something from nothing. The art of survival wasn't in abundance but in transformation. So you prepare a thin broth, boiling bones until they surrender their last flavor. You soak stale bread in the liquid and call it dinner. The smell fills the room, a ghost of meat more than a meal, but your stomach welcomes it. This, you realize, is what it took to survive the medieval cold. Not grand gestures, but small triumphs, one spoon at a time. The wealthier folk fared better, of course. They had pantries lined with barrels of salted beef, smoked bacon, preserved fruit. Monasteries, too, were safe havens of supply, root cellars stacked with dried peas, pickled vegetables, and ale brewed to last the season. But even among nobles, indulgence had limits. I didn't care for titles. When blizzards swept the countryside, even castles grew cold and kitchens went quiet. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood nutrition. Some say they simply endured. Others claim they were surprisingly resourceful, blending superstition and practicality into their meals. For example, they believed onions could ward off illness, that garlic kept your blood warm, and that certain herbs could banish melancholy. In truth, these instincts weren't entirely wrong. Vitamins and flavor often came hand in hand. Then there were the creative cheats. Bread stretched with ground acorns or peas. Ale brewed weak to last longer. March beer, they called it, flat, brown, and barely drinkable. You smile, imagining a medieval brewer muttering that same complaint we all know today. It's watered down, and if the hunger grew too sharp, that's when the stranger stories emerge. Villagers gathering to eat bark boiled from trees. Families trapping rats or crows. A few scholars whisper about desperate winters when famine blurred the line between survival and sin. You shiver not just from the cold but from the thought of what people become when nature takes everything back. Still, humans adapted. One clever invention from the north was the soup stone. A smooth stone kept in the hearth all day, then dropped into the pot to retain heat and keep broth simmering. It didn't add flavor, but it saved fuel. There's something poetic in that, warming your stomach with the memory of fire. By evening, the whole village feels quieter, slower. Bells ring less often, voices drop to whispers, and people conserve not just food but energy. The rhythm of life changes. You go to bed earlier, rise later, and spend more hours gathered close to the fire, telling stories you've told 100 times before. You glance around at your companions. The farmer, the widow, the child curled up near the hearth, and realize storytelling isn't entertainment, it's sustenance. Every tale, every shared laugh, keeps morale alive when everything else fades. Words feed the soul. An old saying goes, and here that's no metaphor. Sometimes those stories twist into strange shapes. Myths of frost spirits that walk through villages, of wolves that speak with human voices, of saints who promise warmth to the faithful. You hear them with half belief and half longing. Maybe, deep down, everyone in this world needs to believe the cold has rules, that it listens, bargains, maybe even shows mercy. And yet, amid all this bleakness, there's something oddly peaceful. The night sky glitters sharper in the frost. Snow muffles the world until even the church bell sounds like a lullaby. You can almost feel the earth itself resting, sleeping beneath its white blanket. You understand now why medieval people marked midwinter with feasts like Yule and Candlemas, to remind themselves that light always returns. You sit by the fire and think of how people today flick a switch to summon heat, while back then, every spark was earned. Each meal, each ember, each laugh shared was a victory against a season trying to erase you. You can almost respect the cold now. Tested you, but it also shaped you. Before bed, you kneel to say a small prayer, not for wealth or luck, but for endurance. Outside, the wind moans through the thatch. Inside, the fire sighs low, a living heart in the room's center. You tuck yourself into your rough blankets, feeling both fragile and timeless. You think of the old medieval proverb, "Winter will ask what you did all summer." You smile at its quiet wisdom. You've learned to answer honestly. I prepared, I endured, I survived. The candle flickers out. The room breathes one last puff of smoke. And as you drift toward sleep, you feel, just for a moment, that the cold no longer hunts you. It hums beside you, old and familiar, like an ancient friend keeping watch. You wake before dawn again, the air thick with that deep, bone-deep stillness that only happens in midwinter. For a few seconds, you forget where you are, just a shape in the darkness, listening to your own heartbeat echo in the wooden room. Then you feel it, the cold biting at your nose, creeping under the blankets, reminding you you're still very much alive. You stretch out your hands toward the embers and realize the fire died overnight. There's nothing more cruel than a dead hearth in the morning. You mutter to yourself as you blow gently into the ashes, praying for a spark. Your breath fogs, your fingers ache, and the smell of old smoke clings to everything. When at last a small flame flickers back to life, it feels like victory, a fragile, glowing defiance against nature itself. But today isn't about warmth or hunger. It's about time, the strange way the medieval winter rewired people's lives. When the sun rose late and set before supper, every day was carved in half. You did less, moved slower, and thought more. It wasn't laziness, it was adaptation. In summer, medieval life burst with motion. Plowing, planting, markets, gossip, travel. But in the cold months, everything contracted. You didn't just stay inside your home, you stayed inside yourself. Work turned inward, repairing tools, spinning wool, mending clothes, brewing ale. It was a season of patience, and patience was a kind of survival. Historians still argue whether medieval people saw winter as hardship or holy pause. Church calendars filled these months with feasts and fasts. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Lent. All reminders to reflect and repent. Maybe that's how people kept their sanity when everything outside screamed silence. By giving the cold a spiritual purpose. You can almost feel it as you sit by the dim window. The world outside may be frozen, but inside, time softens. You imagine a monk scratching ink across parchment by candlelight, his breath frosting the margin as he copies ancient words. A housewife hums softly as she darns a hole in her child's cloak. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls, a sound that seems to stretch the day's edges just a little wider. When there's no daylight to waste, even leisure changes shape. You might carve wood, tell stories, or play simple games, throwing bones, rolling dice, singing. Laughter carries strangely in cold rooms, sharp and thin but genuine. Maybe you share gossip about a neighbor's cow or whisper that the baker's daughter has been sneaking out at night. You smile. It's comforting to know even in the Middle Ages, people found warmth in other people's business. Outside, though, time still ruled you. The sun decided when you woke, when you worked, when you rested. There were no clocks ticking on the wall, no glowing screens to mark the hours. Time was measured by chores and by shadows, and in winter both grew short. The day is dying, people said, and they meant it literally. The nights, on the other hand, were endless. Some of the longest nights of the medieval year stretched nearly 16 hours, long enough for dreams to overlap with waking. You lie in bed, half asleep, listening to the wind moan through the thatch, and you understand why people once believed the dark had power. There's an old belief, half faith, half fear, that winter nights were when the world of the dead came closest to the living. Ghosts wandered roads, spirits whispered at windows, and the wild hunt thundered across the sky. You picture yourself hearing hooves overhead, wondering if it's wind or something older. Medieval folks didn't need horror movies. They had winter. One of the most curious traditions was the second sleep. Without artificial light, people's nights split naturally into two halves. You'd go to bed soon after dark, wake around midnight, pray, talk, even visit neighbors, then drift off again until dawn. Historians still debate whether this was universal or regional, but the pattern makes sense. When the night is longer than your dreams, you fill it however you can. You stir the coals again, watching their orange glow pulse like tiny hearts. The quiet feels almost holy. You realize something the medievals must have known too, that darkness isn't just an absence of light, it's a presence all its own. A space where thought slows down and sound becomes intimate. You lean back, let the firelight paint your face, and imagine living in a time when every flicker meant safety and every shadow meant mystery. You can hear a faint owl outside, calling to the fields. For a moment, the world feels suspended, caught between centuries, between sleep and waking. You wonder what they dreamed about, those people who lived and died centuries before central heating. Did they dream of summer wheat swaying in the wind? Of banquets and laughter and songs? Or maybe, like you, they just dreamed of warmth, the kind that never fades, even when the fire goes out. The stillness deepens, the fire crackles. You take a slow breath, thinking of how the medieval mind turned monotony into ritual. Fasting wasn't just hunger, it was purification. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was communion. Maybe that's what winter taught them, that endurance itself could be sacred. You poke the fire again, smiling faintly. Work while it is day, the monks used to say, for the night cometh when no man can work. Maybe the night that cometh wasn't just darkness but reflection, a kind of spiritual winter where you learned what mattered. Outside, the stars are sharp enough to hurt your eyes. You step into the snow and feel the entire village sleeping, wrapped in quiet. A thin wisp of smoke rises from each roof like a heartbeat. You walk a few paces, your boots creaking, and think about how winter changes people. Not just their habits, but their souls. Back inside, you pull the blankets close, your body still humming with the rhythm of the day's small labors. There's a calm that comes with surrendering to the pace of the season, a rhythm older than clocks. You feel it now, that pulse of patience, the same one that carried every medieval villager through the frozen dark and into spring. And as you close your eyes, you realize that time, like fire, is something you don't fight, you tend it. You keep it alive, ember by ember, night after night. You wake to a faint drumming on the roof. Not rain, ice, frozen pellets rattling against the thatch, each one a tiny percussion of winter's persistence. The air feels sharper than yesterday, and even the fire seems tired of fighting. You pull your cloak tighter, step outside, and see your breath hang in the air like smoke. The world has turned white again overnight, an unbroken sheet of frost stretching over every roof, branch, and field. Winter isn't just a season anymore. It's an ecosystem, a set of rules everyone must obey. You feel that truth as you walk toward the animal shed. The ground crunches like glass beneath your boots. You push the door open, and warm air, musky, sour, and alive, rushes out. The cows blink slowly, their breath steaming. A few chickens huddle in the straw, feathers puffed out like small shields. They, too, are part of this delicate alliance against the cold. Keeping livestock alive through winter was as crucial as keeping people warm. Milk, eggs, wool, and dung, yes, even dung, were survival tools. You take a pitchfork and begin spreading hay, aware that every mouthful you give them shortens your own stores. It's a strange balance. Feed them too much and you go hungry. Too little and they die, and so do you. The smell of the barn is thick, sweet hay and sour waste, the aroma of endurance. You rub a cow's flank. Her hide is cold to the touch, but under it, there's warmth. A small, beating furnace that reminds you why medieval homes often shared walls with their animals. It wasn't superstition or sentiment. It was survival by proximity. The beasts gave heat, breath, and sometimes, when desperate times came, one last meal. Historians still argue whether medieval people were kinder to their animals than we assume. Some records show affection, naming oxen, whispering blessings before slaughter. Others reveal brutal necessity, where compassion froze under hunger's weight. Maybe the truth lies between those extremes. Maybe love and survival have always been uneasy companions. You scoop water from a frozen trough, breaking the ice with a stick. The sound is sharp, ringing like glass. You pour some into a bucket and carry it inside, feeling the cold seep through the metal into your palms. Your fingers ache, but the rhythm of chores keeps you moving. In winter, motion itself is warmth. Stop too long, and you feel the cold creeping up your legs like ivy. Back inside, you add another stick to the fire. The flames leap, hesitant at first, then eager, as if relieved to be fed. The house smells faintly of wet wool and smoke. In the corner, herbs hang from a beam: sage, thyme, rosemary. All dried months ago when the sun still had color. You crumble a few into the pot simmering over the fire, not for flavor but for hope. You think about how people fought sickness in this kind of world. Winter wasn't just cold, it was contagious. Coughs turned to fevers, fevers to death. With no hospitals nearby and no doctors for the poor, healing was half luck, half belief. You remember stories of garlic necklaces to ward off plague, of vinegar-soaked rags tied over mouths, of charms scratched onto door frames. Historians still debate whether these rituals offered any real protection. But maybe protection wasn't the point. Maybe people needed to believe that something, anything, could keep the darkness out. You stir the pot again, thick with barley and roots, and listen to the quiet. The medieval winter taught people the art of patience. Illness came and went on its own schedule, and often all you could do was wait. Herbal remedies filled that waiting time. Nettle tea for strength, elderberry syrup for coughs, and, for the more desperate, mixtures of ale and ground frog bones. Yes, really, medieval medicine had creativity, if not consistency. You can almost see the local healer at work. A woman in her 50s, hands cracked, eyes sharp. She knows every plant within a mile, every superstition, every scar in the village. Some whisper she's a witch. Others call her wise woman. The line between healer and heretic was thinner than ice. Yet when sickness came, everyone found their way to her door. In that way, the cold didn't just test bodies, it tested faith. Faith in herbs, in prayer, in the fragile promise of spring. Each candle lit in the chapel was both devotion and desperation. You picture the villagers kneeling on the cold stone floor, whispering for mercy. Their breath mixes with incense, rising like mist. For them, God wasn't distant. He was frost and fire both. Outside, a distant bell tolls. A funeral, maybe. Winter deaths were so common that burial grounds froze before the living could dig. In those times, bodies were sometimes stored in barns until the ground softened. Sounds grim now, but back then, it was simply part of the rhythm. Like planting, like harvesting, like surviving. And yet, amid all this bleakness, you notice something beautiful. The way frost crystals form on the window, delicate as lace. The way light spills over the snow, turning it gold for a heartbeat before fading gray again. Even in hardship, there's art, small, fleeting, accidental. You realize that perhaps beauty itself was a survival tool. When there's nothing to eat and nowhere warm to hide, noticing the shimmer of ice might be enough to keep hope alive. By dusk, you're exhausted. You feed the fire one last time, settle by its glow, and rest your feet near the warmth. The smell of stew fills the room, and for a few hours, the world feels manageable. You sip slowly, feel the warmth spread through your chest, and think about how your ancestors did the same thing. Century after century, flame after flame. The cold knocks at the window, a slow, patient rhythm. You listen to it without fear now. The day was hard, but you endured. You always do, and somewhere in that endurance is the quiet wisdom of those who lived before you. That even when winter takes everything, it never takes the will to continue. You breathe in smoke, herbs, and the faint sweetness of life. Outside, the stars burn clear as ice, and you think, maybe that's what survival really is. Not fighting the cold, but learning to glow within it. As dusk fell across the fortified monastery, a strange stillness swept over the valley. The monks moved through the stone corridors with measured steps, carrying candles whose wavering flames painted ghosts upon the walls. It was the night of the Feast of Shadows, a tradition older than any written chronicle, whispered to predate even the abbey itself. They called it a celebration of Thanksgiving. Yet no one could recall what exactly they were giving thanks for. In the 9th hour of the 9th night, the bells must not sound. Those words were carved into a wooden plaque above the chapel's entrance, faded and half-buried under centuries of soot. Few dared ask what they meant. The brothers gathered in silence beneath the vaulted ceiling, the air thick with incense and the scent of old wax. At the center of the hall stood a massive oaken table, set not with food, but with 9 empty plates, each adorned with symbols burned deep into their surface. Spirals, crosses, and something resembling a coiled serpent swallowing its own tail. The abbot, a gaunt man whose eyes never seemed to blink, took his place at the head of the table. With a tremor barely noticeable, he raised his hands. In shadow we feast. In silence we give. The monks echoed him in unison. The sound filled the chamber, strange and hollow, as if the walls themselves absorbed the words. Then came the tolling of the 9th bell. A single chime rolled down from the tower, deep and resonant. The abbot's head snapped up, and his eyes went wide. One of the younger brothers, a novice named Aldrich, had forgotten the ancient warning carved above the door. He had gone to ring the bell out of habit, not knowing what would follow. First, nothing happened. The candle flames flickered but did not die. The silence held for a moment too long, the kind of silence that feels like something watching. Then, from the far end of the hall, the shadows began to move. They lengthened unnaturally, spilling across the floor like dark water. The empty plates on the table trembled, and one by one, black shapes began to rise from them. Not smoke, not mist, but forms. Human-like, yet hollow, as if made from the absence of light. The monks fell to their knees, crossing themselves in panic. Aldrich stumbled backward, his candle falling from his hand. The flame died instantly, snuffed out by a breath no one could hear. "Forgive me, Father. I didn't mean." But the abbot did not move to help him. His gaze was fixed upon the apparitions that now encircled the table. These were the guests of the feast, said to be the souls of those who had once dwelled in the abbey when it was still a fortress, before faith had replaced war. According to the oldest records, 9 knights had fallen defending this valley, and it was said their spirits returned each century to dine in silence, claiming their place once more. They did not speak, nor breathe. Their heads bowed, their hands resting upon the table as though remembering a meal long forgotten. The abbot whispered the final prayer, his voice trembling. "From the shadow we came, to the shadow we return. Grant us mercy, O Lord of Dusk." But the shadows did not grant mercy. Aldrich, frozen where he stood, watched as the black forms slowly turned their hollow faces toward him. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw eyes, pale, glimmering ancient, staring straight into his soul. Then came the whisper. It filled his mind like cold water, drowning thought, washing away all but fear. His body moved without command, his feet dragging him to the table. One of the Shadow Knights reached out a long, formless hand and touched his brow. The candlelight dimmed, the air grew heavy, and Aldrich's body collapsed upon the floor. But his shadow remained standing. The monks dared not approach. They watched as the new shadow took its place among the others, bowing its head in perfect silence. The circle was complete, 9 guests once again. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, all the candles extinguished. The hall plunged into utter darkness. When dawn came, the abbot was found alone at the table, his eyes wide open, his hair turned stark white. The plates were gone. The carvings upon the table had changed, no longer 9 spirals, but 10. In the 10th shadow, the feast begins anew. Word of the incident spread slowly through the nearby villages. Pilgrims came to the monastery to see the Hall of the 10th Shadow, but none were allowed inside. The abbot forbade it, sealing the doors with wax and prayer. Yet every year, on the same night, villagers claimed to see lights flickering behind the sealed windows and hear faint chanting carried by the wind. Some said it was the abbot, keeping vigil with his lost brothers. Others whispered that the shadows still dined, waiting for the next bell to sound. Centuries later, the monastery fell into ruin. Ivy climbed the walls, the roof collapsed, and the bell tower leaned toward the earth like a weary pilgrim. But the legend endured. Travelers still avoid the valley on the Feast of Shadows, fearing that the toll of any bell might wake the guests again. Archaeologists who visited in the late 19th century found strange evidence. The remnants of wax, arranged in perfect circles, and a table stone etched with spiral marks impossible to date. No bones, no relics, only silence. 9 shadows came to dine. 1 human joined their line. When 10 sit still, the night will kill, and dawn shall not divine. The valley remains quiet now, but if you ever hear a single bell toll in the dark, even by mistake, remember the old words above the chapel door. In the 9th hour of the 9th night, the bells must not sound. The ruins of St. Gervas Abbey had long been left to time. Its walls stood like broken ribs against the gray sky, and the wind that passed through them seemed to whisper the forgotten prayers of centuries. For most, it was nothing but another relic of faith's slow decay, a place for moss and memory. But for one man, it was the beginning of an obsession. In the autumn of 1893, Dr. William Mercer, a historian from Oxford, arrived in the valley with a journal in his satchel and skepticism in his heart. He had heard the stories, tales of ghostly feasts and living shadows, and dismissed them as monastic folklore. Yet, there was one detail he could not ignore. A parchment found in the Vatican archives, sealed with the abbey's crest, dated 1459. It spoke of a hidden chamber beneath the altar, where no light may rest. Mercer's curiosity outweighed his disbelief. To the keeper of faith is given a door beneath the dawn, where the 10th shadow waits for the return of the bell. The phrase had no theological meaning he could decipher. And so, with a small team of local laborers and a lantern that hissed faintly in the wind, Mercer descended into the abbey's hollow belly. The lower levels were half flooded, the air heavy with rot. Rats skittered along the walls, their eyes glinting in the lamplight. For hours they searched, through crypts, through collapsed cloisters, through corridors no wider than a coffin. Then one of the men, a gaunt fellow named Renaud, found it. A stone slab, different from the others, engraved with 9 spirals circling a 10th. Its edges bore faint scorch marks, as though it had once been sealed with fire. Mercer knelt beside it, brushing away the centuries of dust. "Here," he murmured, "the 10th shadow." With iron bars and brute strength, they pried the slab loose. A burst of cold air struck their faces, colder than winter, dry as bone. Beneath, a staircase spiraled downward into darkness. They descended one by one, their lanterns swinging wildly against the unseen walls. The stone steps were slick, carved with symbols that grew stranger the deeper they went. First crosses, then circles, then shapes that looked like eyes watching from the rock itself. After 27 steps, they reached a door of black wood bound in rusted iron. Upon it was carved a single Latin phrase, Umbra recipit lumen, the shadow receives the light. Mercer placed his palm against the door. It was warm. The hinges groaned as the door swung inward, revealing a small circular chamber. The air was thick, almost oily, and the smell, wax, incense, and something older, like dust soaked in blood. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, perfectly preserved. Upon it rested 9 bowls, identical in size and shape, each filled with a strange black residue. Behind the altar, carved into the wall, was a 10th bowl, but this one was empty. Mercer felt his heart quicken. He took out his notebook, his pencil trembling. 9 filled, 1 void. The pattern repeats. He instructed Renaud to take a sample of the residue, but the moment the metal tool touched the surface of the bowl, the black dust seemed to breathe, shifting like ash stirred by wind. The lantern dimmed. Renaud stumbled back, muttering a prayer. The others refused to enter the chamber, crossing themselves furiously. Mercer, more curious than cautious, leaned closer. The residue shimmered faintly, a pattern of tiny motes, swirling in rhythm, as if responding to his presence. Then faintly came the sound. 1 single bell. The men froze. Mercer's lantern flickered, the flame shrinking to a thread of blue light. The air turned icy. A shadow moved across the far wall, though no one stood near it. He turned to flee, but the door had already closed. "Open it!" he shouted, pounding his fists against the wood. Renaud and the others pulled at the iron, but the hinges would not budge. Behind them, the altar began to hum, a deep vibration that rattled their bones. From the bowls rose a dark mist, twisting and joining in the air above the altar. It formed no clear shape, only movement, like a crowd shifting behind fog. Mercer stumbled backward, his voice breaking. "This can't be real. This can't." The mist began to whisper. The phrases came in fragments. 10 complete. The feast returns. Ring no more. Renaud screamed and ran toward the door. The moment his hand touched the iron, he was thrown backward. His body struck the ground lifeless, his shadow still pinned against the wall, moving long after his breath had stopped. Mercer fell to his knees, gasping. The lantern shattered, plunging them into blackness. Only the faint glow from the bowls remained, 9 circles of light, surrounding the empty 10th. He crawled toward it, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he reached out his hand, the darkness seemed to pull him in, wrapping around his wrist, his arm, his face, until he vanished from sight. When the local constables arrived days later, they found the stairway collapsed, the slab resealed by some unknown force. Of the men, there was no trace, only the lantern handle and Mercer's notebook, its last page stained black. The final entry read, "The 10th bowl calls to be filled." The feast was never ended, merely waiting. The ruins were abandoned once again. But the villagers began to report strange lights beneath the abbey at night, and the faint sound of a single bell echoing from the ground. No one goes near St. Gervas after dark anymore, and those who do swear that if you press your ear to the stones, you can still hear the faint hum of voices below, the sound of guests who never left their table. In shadow we feast, in silence we give. The 10th bowl waits, still empty. You probably don't think much about your bed. Soft, warm, a gentle invitation to disappear for a few hours. But in the medieval world, your bed could mean the difference between life and death. Tonight, you'll slip under a set of itchy wool blankets stuffed with straw, surrounded by creaking wood, flickering embers, and the faint breath of others huddled too close for comfort. You shuffle toward a low wooden frame. The bed is short, angled, and barely wide enough for 2. People didn't lie flat then. They slept sitting up, half-propped, fearing that lying flat made it easier for death, or demons, to sneak in during the night. You'd pull your cloak tight, wrap your feet in linen strips, and hope the cold didn't find its way through the seams. Forget silk pajamas, your sleepwear was whatever you wore all day. Bathing was rare in winter, so every blanket smelled faintly of sweat, smoke, and cabbage soup. Not exactly lavender-scented dreams. But warmth was the goal, not glamour. And warmth, in medieval Europe, required creativity that bordered on madness. People layered sheepskins, old rags, and even moss between the sheets to trap body heat. If you were lucky or rich, you might have feather stuffing, though most feathers went into quills for writing, not comfort. Historians still argue whether the so-called straw tick mattress was a mark of luxury or poverty. It could feel soft, but after a week it hosted a thriving civilization of bugs, fleas, and mites. So yes, you weren't sleeping alone. Every night was a festival of scratching and slapping. Monks in some abbeys even had wooden sleep paddles to chase off lice without breaking silence. But there's a strange intimacy to it all, isn't there? Families often shared beds, parents, children, sometimes servants, and in some regions even travelers. It wasn't scandalous. It was survival. Body heat was the cheapest currency in the cold economy of winter. Imagine that, half a dozen people pressed together under one blanket. You can hear breathing from every direction, the shuffle of feet, the soft murmur of a dream. A baby cries, a dog sighs, someone mumbles a prayer. The room glows with firelight, but the fire itself is barely alive. Fed with damp logs, there's smoke curling along the rafters. You cough once, twice. It burns your throat, but it's still better than freezing. Fireplaces then were inefficient, their warmth swallowed by stone chimneys. So people devised tricks. Thick curtains hung around the bed to trap warmth, or bed boxes, wooden enclosures you'd climb into like a cupboard. If you were of lower class, you might even sleep in the kitchen near the embers. Richer households used bed warmers. Small pans filled with coals slid beneath the sheets, but misused them and you'd wake up to ashes or worse, fire. So, safety tip from the 14th century, never fall asleep on top of your own heating system. But warmth wasn't only physical. Sleep had a spiritual dimension too. Medieval people believed that night was when the soul wandered, and dreams could be divine messages or demonic traps. You didn't just close your eyes, you crossed into another realm. Many prayed specific bedtime prayers, not to die in their sleep, or to keep nightmares from entering through the mouth. One old charm even advised placing iron scissors under the pillow, blades slightly open, to scare away evil spirits. Some even whispered that the cold itself was a kind of spirit, an invisible guest slipping through keyholes, curling around your feet, waiting for you to fall asleep before it settled into your lungs. Doctors of the time, doctors, warned that sudden chills during sleep could unbalance the four humors, causing madness or death. That's why some peasants refused to open their windows even once all winter. Air was dangerous. You'd think these beliefs would fade, but echoes remain even now. You still pull the blanket to your chin. You still tuck your toes beneath it, warding off the unseen. The wealthy, of course, did it differently. Their bedrooms were grand chambers lined with tapestries depicting saints or hunting scenes. Servants prepared the beds, layering linen sheets, wool covers, fur throws, fox, marten, or even ermine. Candles flickered beside gilded icons. A nobleman might slip between sheets embroidered with his crest, while his servants slept on straw in the adjoining corridor. But even luxury had limits. Castles were stone refrigerators, their halls echoing with cold. Travelers from warmer lands often complained that English or French lords kept homes colder than their hearts. You could have 100 blankets and still see your breath. As the night deepened, another ritual unfolded, the first sleep and second sleep. People didn't sleep straight through the night then. They'd drift off for a few hours, wake around midnight, tend the fire, pray, talk quietly, even visit neighbors. Then they'd return for their second sleep until dawn. It was an ancient rhythm, broken only by the coming of artificial light. That middle-of-the-night interlude was strangely peaceful. Some wrote letters, others read scripture, lovers whispered. The world was still, the sky a bowl of stars, and the only sounds were crackling wood and the heartbeat of shared breath. There's even a theory still debated that this two-part sleep helped people cope with hunger and fear. Dividing the night meant you didn't feel time stretch endlessly. It also gave you a chance to check if your livestock or your children were still alive. Historians still argue whether this pattern was universal or regional, but the idea lingers. Sleep as something sacred, divided, purposeful. Not a simple act of rest, but a negotiation between warmth and darkness. Outside, frost forms on the window pane. The dog shifts beside you, its body heat a small miracle. The fire sputters and sighs. You close your eyes, hearing the heartbeat of the house, the creak of timbers, the distant howl of wind across the thatch. You drift, briefly, into dreams where summer still exists, where rivers run and wheat sways golden under a forgiving sun. Then, as the cold presses closer, your body curls tighter, seeking any trace of warmth. At least you're not alone, even if the lice are technically also in attendance. Because that was the secret art of sleeping warm in the medieval cold. It wasn't about comfort or luxury or even health. It was about togetherness. You endured the night not by conquering the cold, but by outlasting it, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, heart to heart. And as dawn's gray light finally slips through the cracks, you rise not refreshed, but simply relieved. Another night survived. Another morning earned. You wake before dawn, frost creeping along the inside of the window like ghostly vines. The fire's gone out again. You can see your breath when you exhale, a white wisp that fades into the dark. For medieval people, that simple breath, the cold one you can see, wasn't just air. It was your soul, briefly visible, wandering into the world of spirits. The medieval cold wasn't just weather. It was a presence, alive, watchful, and, in many tales, divine punishment made flesh. In villages where the wind screamed like a living thing, people whispered that winter came because the saints had turned their faces away. That when men sinned too freely, God himself froze the rivers to wash the land clean again. One story from the 13th century tells of St. Hubert's winter, a season so cold that wine turned solid in its barrels and birds froze mid-flight. They said Hubert, a hunter-turned-saint, punished the proud nobles who hunted on Sundays by cursing the land with endless frost. Whether he did or not, no one dared test it twice. These myths weren't just fear, they were explanations. When crops failed and animals died, someone had to be blamed. Maybe it was the greedy landlord, or the widow rumored to speak with wolves. Or maybe, more dangerously, the cold itself was possessed. The work of invisible frost spirits that slipped through doors and kissed children's lips blue as they slept. In the Germanic regions, peasants told tales of the Frau Holly, an old woman of the mountains who shook her feather bed to make it snow. She was both nurturer and judge, rewarding the diligent with warm spring winds and punishing the lazy with blizzards that lasted for weeks. In Slavic lands, she became Morosko, the frost father, a glittering man made of ice who roamed the forests. Kind souls who greeted him politely received warmth and food. The rude? He touched their faces until their skin turned white and silent forever. It sounds charming until you realize these weren't bedtime fairy tales. They were survival manuals wrapped in myth. Be kind, work hard, share your bread, they taught, or the frost will take you. Meanwhile, in the British Isles, another legend drifted through taverns and abbeys alike. The tale of the Snow Saint, a hooded figure who walked the moors each winter night, collecting the souls of those who froze before dawn. They said if you saw him, you had 1 hour left to find shelter, or you'd join his silent procession by morning. You can almost imagine them, can't you? Huddled by the fire, spinning these stories while wind clawed at the shutters. The flames flicker, the shadows shift, and the oldest man in the room begins to speak, his voice slow and low. Once, when the cold came early, and the church bells froze mid-ring, the people begged the priest to light the holy candles. But the wax cracked in his hands. He said the frost wasn't from this world. It came from below, not above. In the medieval imagination, cold could come from hell as easily as heaven. Fire and brimstone wasn't the only punishment people feared. Many thought the devil could freeze you in place, turning the unrepentant into statues of ice. In Icelandic sagas, cursed men wandered the tundra as draugr, undead spirits whose bodies never decayed because the frost preserved them. Their footsteps sounded like cracking wood, and sometimes myth bled into history. During the Great Frost of 1315, chroniclers described hearing voices in the snow, cries that seemed to come from beneath the frozen earth. One French monk wrote that the cold spoke with tongues not of man nor beast. Historians still argue whether he was describing cracking ice or something else. Either way, it didn't sell many tickets to winter pilgrimages that year. But not every myth was terrifying. Some were gentle, even comforting. In the far north, children were told that frost was the breath of sleeping angels, their sighs covering the world in silver until spring woke them. Others believed the stars themselves dropped shards of ice into rivers at night, freezing them from within. You might smile, but when every winter killed thousands, these stories gave shape to the fear. You can't negotiate with weather, but you can pray to a frost saint, or whisper a charm, or leave a bowl of milk on the windowsill for the cold spirits to taste. It made the invisible enemy feel personal and maybe, just maybe, persuadable. Even kings embraced these beliefs. Chronicles from the reign of Edward III mention royal processions carrying holy relics through blizzards to appease the wrath of winter. Monasteries held fires of mercy, burning herbs and singing psalms until sunrise. No one really knew if it worked, but after a night of shared fear and singing, the cold felt a little less cruel. And you can see echoes of those medieval myths in what we still say today. When we describe someone as cold-hearted, when we say, give them the cold shoulder, even when we talk about a chilling silence or a frosty stare, the language remembers what our ancestors feared most. That cold wasn't emptiness. It was a motionless judgment. In some churches, old stained glass still shows winter personified. Not as snowflakes, but as a blue-faced man clutching a torch, the flame turned upside down. He's not evil, just eternal. The reminder that warmth is never permanent, and every fire eventually cools. But maybe the strangest myth of all came from the Alps, where shepherds claimed that once every 100 years, the frost itself would dream. On that night, they said no wind would blow, no sound would stir. If you walked outside then, time would stop, and you'd see the frost's dreams painted on the air like ghostly shapes. Frozen deer, sleeping maidens, forgotten kings. If that were true, you'd almost want to risk it, wouldn't you? Just to see what winter dreams about when it finally closes its eyes. But beneath every myth, whether it's Frau Holly, Morozko, or the Snow Saint, there's the same truth. People built stories to make the cold bearable, to give frost a face, to believe that if you lit one more candle, or sang one more verse, you might convince winter to let you live another day. So tonight, when you see your breath in the air, or hear wind scratching against the glass, think of them. The farmers, the monks, the storytellers, speaking softly into the dark, building small fires of words against the vast, frozen night. Because sometimes, survival begins with a story. For centuries, people believed the world simply shifted between warm and cold by whim of the heavens. But historians and climatologists, digging through the bones of time, have since uncovered a deeper mystery. A slow war between humanity and a changing earth. The story begins not with kings or plagues, but with tree rings, ice cores, and the quiet archives of the natural world. In frozen Greenland, deep beneath the surface, scientists have drilled columns of ancient ice that stretch back thousands of years. Each layer, a page in a diary written by the planet itself. Tiny bubbles trapped in that ice reveal a strange story. Around the year 1300, the world began to cool. Glaciers advanced. Rivers froze more often. Crops failed. It was the beginning of what we now call the Little Ice Age. But this was not a single winter. It was a slow, creeping cold that lasted for centuries. From Iceland to Italy, people wrote of terrible summers, of snow that refused to melt, of harvests that never came. In England, records show that the River Thames froze so thickly that entire festivals were held upon it. Frost fairs, they were called, complete with markets, musicians, and even roasted meat sizzling above the ice. It sounds charming, almost festive, until you remember why they celebrated. Because they had no choice. When the cold ruled, life had to bend. Historians still debate what caused it. Some say volcanoes, their eruptions darkening the sky with ash, cutting off the sun's warmth. Others point to cycles of solar activity, subtle wobbles in Earth's orbit, or even ocean currents shifting their paths. But beyond the science lies a deeper fascination. How this age of cold shaped human destiny. Consider the Vikings. For centuries, they thrived in Greenland and across the North Atlantic, farming sheep and barley on land now buried under permafrost. But as the cold deepened, their crops withered. Their trade routes froze. By the 1400s, the Norse settlements in Greenland had vanished entirely. No one knows their exact fate, but the evidence suggests a slow extinction, a people losing their war against the frost. And yet, while the Vikings faded, other cultures adapted. In the Alps, villagers learned to terrace their fields higher up the slopes to catch what little sunlight remained. In the Netherlands, the encroaching cold drove engineers to new heights of ingenuity. They built canals, windmills, and floodgates to manage both ice and sea. Strangely, it was in this frozen hardship that Dutch art and trade flourished, birthing the golden age of Amsterdam. The Little Ice Age didn't just sculpt landscapes, it reshaped minds. Painters began depicting the cold itself, vast white skies and people skating on frozen rivers. Writers and priests, too, saw divine patterns in the weather. They spoke of punishment, of moral decay bringing down the chill of God's displeasure. In sermons across Europe, frost became a symbol of sin and renewal, the earth purging itself, demanding humility. And yet, among these records of faith and frost, modern historians find something else, a reflection of resilience. Because the cold, for all its cruelty, forged innovations we still rely on today. Crop rotation, better storage of food, stronger homes and tools, communities learning to depend on one another. Even the early study of weather, what we now call meteorology, was born in these frozen centuries. There's something haunting about this realization, that progress is often born not from comfort, but from cold. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the argument still unfolding between scholars. Was the Little Ice Age a natural swing in climate, destined to come and go? Or was it a delicate warning, a glimpse of how fragile human life is when the balance shifts? The truth, as always, lies between ice and ash. Some modern scientists go further, comparing that ancient chill to our present warmth. They warn that just as the medieval world was reshaped by centuries of cold, ours may be reshaped by decades of heat. The same patterns of migration, famine, and adaptation may soon play again, but in reverse. The stage is set not for frost, but for fire. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson the Little Ice Age leaves us. That history, like climate, never truly ends. It merely changes its temperature. Narration softens, closing gently. In the archives of the world's weather, the voices of the frozen past still whisper. They remind us that survival is not guaranteed by warmth or wealth, but by will. That every ember we tend, every shelter we build, is part of the same old story, humankind against the elements. And for those who study the ice, each layer they uncover is not just a record of what once was. It's a reflection of what could be again. The cold was not just a season. It became a rhythm, a pattern that dictated every breath of medieval life. As the Little Ice Age deepened, kingdoms themselves seemed to drift into slumber. Fields froze into stone. Rivers turned to glass. Even the bells of cathedrals rang slower in the brittle air. To survive the endless winter, people didn't fight the frost. They learned to live with it. The world became quieter, slower, almost reverent. This was a kingdom in hibernation. In a small village in northern France, life in January meant silence. The plows were stored, the soil locked beneath inches of snow and ice. The smell of earth and sweat, the scent of summer labor was gone. In its place came the sharp smell of smoke and salted meat. Families gathered indoors, their homes packed with hay for insulation. Children slept together on straw beds beside goats and chickens, sharing the breath of living warmth. The outside world faded. Paths vanished beneath snowdrifts. Even church bells sometimes fell mute, their sound muffled by the thick air. Winter was not just weather, it was isolation. For months, villagers became like monks in their own small monasteries, enclosed in walls of wood and frost. But there was also a strange peace in this forced stillness. With the fields asleep, there was little to do but wait, mend, and dream. People turned inward. They carved, they sewed, they told stories. Around the hearth, old legends awakened. Tales of winter spirits, frost demons, and saints who walked across ice. In these months, imagination became the only flame that never went out. In cities, the slumber took a different shape. Trade slowed, ships were trapped in frozen harbors, and streets turned slick with ice. Merchants adapted, selling furs, candles, and firewood instead of summer goods. Inns filled with travelers stranded by storms, pilgrims, traders, and soldiers, all forced into uneasy fellowship. The great markets of Europe became places of endurance rather than commerce. In London, the River Thames itself transformed into a strange new town. When it froze, people built stalls, games, even puppet theaters right on the ice. At the height of these frost fairs, you could buy roasted chestnuts, drink hot wine, or get your name printed on a souvenir sheet proclaiming, "Printed on the frozen Thames, in the year of our Lord, 1684. Yet beneath the laughter and music, there was always fear. The ice might crack without warning. A fire might fall through. And when the thaw finally came, it often brought ruin. Flooded homes, drowned animals, broken bridges. The kingdom's hibernation came with a heavy price. In monasteries, winter was the holiest of seasons. Monks rose before dawn to pray in frigid chapels, breath fogging the air like incense. The stone floors froze beneath their bare feet, yet they saw in that suffering a reflection of Christ's own endurance. Silence became a form of warmth, a barrier against despair. Illuminated manuscripts from this period reveal something curious. The colors shift. Blues deepen, golds fade to gray. Snow creeps into the margins of holy scenes. It is as if even the artists were painting the cold into the fabric of faith. One monk, writing in the 14th century, described the world as a candle guttering in the wind, yet not extinguished. That was the spirit of the age, resignation but also resilience. The nobility, too, learned to hibernate in their own way. Castles were built with thicker walls, smaller windows, and great halls centered around massive hearths. Banquets became rarer, shorter, more somber. Even kings grew humble before the cold. Chronicles tell of monarchs delaying campaigns for years because snow made travel impossible. The world of politics slowed to a crawl, and diplomacy often happened not through letters or envoys but by endurance. Who could survive the winter? Who had enough grain, enough wood, enough will to last until spring? Power was measured not just in armies, but in warmth. In many parts of Europe, local lords began organizing winter stores, early precursors to food banks. Grain was rationed, firewood guarded like gold. Villagers owed not just taxes, but days of labor cutting wood for the community hearth. In return, the Lord's Hall became a refuge, a literal sanctuary of heat and bread. Through this rhythm of freezing and thawing, societies evolved their own pulse of patience. The calendar itself reflected the hibernation of the world. Long winters of rest, short bursts of frantic labor once the thaw arrived. Survival was not about conquest, it was about endurance. And yet, amid all the hardship, winter shaped beauty. Music changed, slower and more melancholic. The carol, once a lively dance tune, became a song of waiting, of faith in return. In poetry, the seasons turned from backdrop to symbol. Winter came to represent mortality, humility, and hope. This spiritual quietude ran deep. To hibernate was not simply to sleep, it was to trust. To believe that after darkness, light would come. After cold, warmth. In every frozen night, the people of the medieval world carried an unspoken prayer. Let us last until spring. By the 17th century, entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but this rhythm of hibernation. The frost shaped their identities. It was said that a northern child could tell the sound of snow by its crunch. Travelers wrote of people who could predict the coming thaw by the smell of the air or the way smoke rose from chimneys. It was, in a way, a world of heightened senses, a civilization taught to feel the earth's breathing through the pulse of the cold. But every sleep must end. By the mid-1800s, as the planet began to warm again, the long winter loosened its grip. Rivers flowed freely, crops grew more abundant, and trade awakened. The old rhythms faded, replaced by the hum of progress and the scent of coal smoke. Humanity, it seemed, had finally awakened from its icy dream. Yet even now, echoes of that hibernating world remain. In our words, winter, frost, thaw, we still speak a language born from centuries of cold. In our rituals of rest, our love of blankets, candles, and quiet nights, we keep something of that medieval stillness alive. Narration slows, voice soft as if whispering across centuries. Perhaps that's what the cold gave us most. Not despair, but the wisdom of waiting. The lesson that even in darkness, life endures in its smallest forms. Sleeping seeds beneath the snow, embers beneath the ash, faith beneath silence. A kingdom in hibernation is not a dead world. It is merely dreaming. And in that dream, humanity found its patience, its resilience, its grace. You feel it before you see it, the subtle softening of the air. The frost no longer bites. It brushes. The snow that once cracked beneath your boots now sighs underfoot. One morning, you wake to the sound of dripping, a rhythm you haven't heard in months. The world is thawing. The medieval cold, for all its cruelty, always bowed to the sun's persistence. The thaw came not as a sudden miracle, but as a quiet rebellion. Ice loosened its grip on rivers. The first trickles became streams, then floods. Smoke rose more lazily from chimneys, less desperate. Chickens emerged from coops, blinking into the pale light. The land exhaled. You step outside and see patches of brown earth breaking through white. The smell hits you first, damp soil, rot, life. It's the scent of endings and beginnings intertwined. For the medieval peasant, this moment was sacred. The thaw meant food, warmth, survival. It meant another year had been earned. Historians still argue whether the transition between medieval winters and the warming centuries that followed was gradual or abrupt. Some point to volcanic eruptions and solar cycles. Others blame shifts in ocean currents. But to those who lived it, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the sun came back. In villages across Europe, the thaw meant celebration. Bells that had fallen silent for months rang again. The first seeds were blessed with prayers, often sprinkled with melted snow as a symbol of renewal. Candles burned longer, not because they were needed, but because people wanted to watch the light. Children played in the mud that appeared where the snow receded, their laughter a sound that hadn't echoed since autumn. The frozen stillness gave way to noise. Hammers, carts, barking dogs, gossip. Life, impatient and messy, rushed back in. And yet, part of the winter remained in them. People who had endured months of scarcity didn't forget hunger easily. Bread was still rationed. Firewood still guarded. They knew the cold would return, as it always did. So they treated spring not as victory, but as mercy. In monasteries, monks marked the thaw with special vigils. The readings shifted from lamentations to psalms of gratitude. One chronicle from York describes how, on the first clear day of spring, the brothers would process barefoot through the cloisters, letting the thawing stones sting their feet, a ritual to remember the hardship behind them and the warmth ahead. You imagine them walking slowly, hoods lowered, their robes brushing the wet stone, each footstep a whisper of thanks, each breath a prayer of endurance fulfilled. Out in the fields, the real work began. The thawed soil was rich but treacherous. Floodwaters carried both fertility and ruin. Farmers raced to repair dikes, mend tools, and sow grain before the next frost. They worked shoulder to shoulder, their hands cracked, their backs bent, but their spirits high. The rhythm of life resumed, and in that motion lay hope. A chronicler from Flanders once wrote that spring is the laughter of the poor. He meant that even those who owned nothing, no land, no title, no security, could feel rich simply because the earth remembered them. Not everything revived so easily. Roads were still broken, trade routes still scarred by ice. Yet the very act of rebuilding forged community. Neighbors helped each other, shared tools, traded food. Bonds frozen by isolation thawed too. In many places, the church took this moment to teach that suffering purifies. The cold, priests said, is the penance of the earth. But ordinary people understood it differently. They saw the thaw as proof of divine patience, that God may sleep, but he never abandons his creation entirely. You sense that same truth as you walk through the dripping forest. The ice on branches trembles, slides, and falls in glistening fragments. Every droplet feels like a heartbeat returning. The little ice age would linger for centuries more, its fingers of frost reaching into the 1800s. But its people learned something timeless, that endurance itself is a form of faith. A historian once called the medieval winter a season that taught humanity how to wait. Perhaps that's why, even now, when we light candles against darkness or wrap ourselves in blankets, we echo those forgotten winters. The instinct to find warmth, to make it, share it, guard it, is part of our inheritance from that frozen age. And so, as you stand in the thawing light, you realize that survival was never just about food or fire. It was about imagination, about believing in warmth even when the world went silent and still. The medieval people didn't merely survive the cold, they learned how to dream through it. In their patience, you find a reflection of your own. The quiet nights you've endured, the storms you've waited out, the fears you've faced with nothing but the faint glow of hope. All of that is part of the same long story. The cold changes shape, but it never truly leaves. Neither does the courage it calls forth. The medieval thaw was both ending and beginning, a whisper from the past saying, "You made it through." Now the world grows quiet again, but in a different way. The frost no longer rules. It lingers gently in corners, like a memory too shy to leave. The air smells of thawed soil, of things waking and stretching. You imagine the last patch of snow melting beside a stone wall, revealing green shoots underneath, impossibly delicate and defiant. You've journeyed through the longest nights, seen fires dwindle and hearts endure. You've watched people sleep beside animals for warmth, pray through frozen dawns, and greet spring with cracked hands and weary joy. And now, at last, the cold loosens its hold. Not vanished, only forgiven. Let yourself breathe slower now. Listen to the soft dripping of ice, the distant song of returning birds. Each sound is proof that stillness can give birth to life again. The medieval world has thawed, and so have you. Somewhere, in a village long gone, a child stirs in bed, the morning sun brushing their face for the first time in months. The warmth feels strange, almost frightening, but they smile, because this is what survival feels like. So rest now. Let the warmth find you, slowly, quietly, completely. The cold has told its story. The night has done its work. And as the final ember fades, remember, spring always comes back.